Very special thanks to Philip Raby Specialist Cars for providing the Aston in this review, of course, and it goes without saying if you're a fan of the series that you know right below this video in the description, you can click on the link there and check out their current stock, maybe even check out this car if you're watching the video close to its release, or of course check out what else they have for sale, usually within the world of Porsche, but with some other specialised stuff as well, such as this car. As we draw near to the end of November and the 2021 season of Beards and Cars, if you will, begins its drawing to a close, this is easily going to be, for me at least, one of the standout cars from the year. This is one of the best surprises I've had while driving a car in 2021 when comparing expectations to how a vehicle actually felt. Because the DB7 for a long time was, in all honesty, an Aston which I never had that much interest in. It just, for whatever reason, never did it for me. Then when it actually came to driving one, especially in this form, which is a post-facelifted inline-six, the earlier supercharged model, I thought that I already knew what to expect. I've already owned a Jag XKR, I've already reviewed multiple Jag XKs and XKRs, and I've even reviewed a 2014 Vantage from Aston, and one of the most iconic cars that they've ever made, the 2005 Vanquish S. So what could this car really bring to the table with barely over 300 horsepower and surely early 90s technology? Well, spoiler alert, this is one of those occasions where a vehicle is so much more than just the sum of its parts, and especially so much more than the sum of its spec, because on paper the early DB7s, by today's standards, don't even sound that quick. I mean, spoiler alert, this car does 0 to 60 in 6.5 seconds. That's barely quicker than my first car, the Volkswagen Touareg V10, which did 0 to 60 in 6.9, as verified here on the channel. That doesn't sound very impressive for an Aston Martin, but the curious thing is, you have to of course remember that this is early 90s we're talking about, but also, it doesn't feel like a 6.5 second car, because the way it delivers its performance feels a whole lot more engaging than that. And as some of you know, for quite some time I've believed that Aston Martin and Maserati actually share a very similar place in the market, wherein neither of them are the most affordable option, neither of them are the fastest option, and neither of them are certainly the easiest to live with. However, they both have that wow factor. They look special, they sound special, and they feel a cut above cars which are more affordable. Could I have purchased a, for example, Jag XFR instead of my Maserati Quattroporte? Of course I could, but I got the Maserati. Could you purchase a Jag XKR for less than a DB7? Absolutely. But this is an Aston, and it does feel different. And for those who are a little less familiar with the DB7, I think this is actually a backstory which is worth knowing, because it's a pretty fun one. A common misconception about the DB7 is it's something of a Jaguar ripoff or an XK parts bin special. It actually couldn't be further from the truth, and even I used to think that, but get this. This car actually originates with Tom Walkinshaw of TWR, a pretty famous name in the UK. He loved racing the Jaguar XJS, but he wanted a more modernised version of that idea. He proposed the vehicle as a project to Jaguar first, but they weren't interested because they didn't have the finances to take the risk at the time in the early 90s. So instead, Ian Callum designed the car, one of his earliest designs, and it ended up being an Aston Martin instead. So in fact, the DB7 predates the Jag XK, which is something not many of us probably knew about or realised. Now, here's where it gets real fun. The DB7 debuted to such overwhelmingly positive buzz and great success for Aston Martin. In fact, from 1994 to 2004, during its run, they sold 7,000 of them, which is a huge number for Aston, in of course multiple forms, that Jaguar actually saw a couple of years after its release just how successful this idea had become will in effect force their hand into developing their own alternative, the XK, a car which of course I've also reviewed here on the channel, and I said in that review I was really keen to see how this one compared, and of course we'll come back to that in just a second. Now, the funny thing is, because Jaguar then made the XK, which as the XK always does undercut the Aston on price, it then forced Aston's hand to update the DB7 into its faster V12 form, once again taking it higher than the Jag in terms of performance, panache, and making it a full-on exotic GT again in comparison to its best rival. So I love how these cars have had almost this constant back and forth. So in effect, even though many of us Jag owners don't realise this, we actually have Aston to thank for the XK. But with that little history lesson out of the way, let's go back for a second to the performance and to the spec, because these earlier cars, this one for example is a 1998, so it's one of the final inline sixes. They ran from 94 to 99 because after the introduction of the V12 and the Jaguar, they lost sales on those, which is understandable. It had been outclassed by itself by that point in its 12-cylinder form. These earlier cars though, with a 3.2 litre supercharged inline six, an Eaton supercharger, put out 335 horsepower and 361 pound-feet of torque. So one of the rare occasions where you have a car with more torque than power. Certainly a vehicle to my taste then. That's about 490 Newton meters of torque, for those who prefer that unit of measurement. Now the performance, as I said, doesn't rock your world by today's standards, up around 160 miles an hour that is, and a 0 to 60 time, as I mentioned, of about 6.5 in this automatic form. Now because this is 90s technology, this is one of those occasions where the manual is quicker. The manual car can do 0 to 60 in about 5.7 seconds, which is actually a lot more impressive for a 330 horsepower vehicle. This one, as I said, is about 6.5, and then the later versions of the autos, around 1997, this one included, had a quicker version of that automatic. Now, the initial cars only had a 4-speed, which again sounds just prehistoric by today's standards, but even the one that I was driving, which as I said is a 98 with the newer V12 facelift applied to it, you'd never guess it was a 4-speed, because I love the gearbox in this thing. In fact, one of the biggest drawbacks of both the Vantage and the Vanquish, which I drove, is how clunky they felt. In the case of this one, it feels suited down to a T to have an automatic, not just because it's a good auto, but because it suits what the car is actually like. This isn't some highway tearing, lap time shattering Porsche GT3 style machine. This is the epitome of a gentleman's GT. This is 100% an old man's car, quote unquote, which just so happens to be some of my favourite kinds of car, because I love a car that you can appreciate at all speeds. If you buy a vehicle that needs a track day to get the most out of it, then I'm sorry, but that doesn't impress me. If you buy a car that needs to be pushed to its limit just to have a smile on your face, then I also probably won't ever buy one. If you have a car though that you can just sit in and feel this is special, or just look at it and think that is a piece of art, or just cruise in it and feel like you're about to pull up to the Met Gala, to me that's far more impressive. That is exactly what, as I mentioned earlier, Astons and Maseratis do offer. They are just a cut above in that way. This fully lives up to that. And interestingly, one of the things which surprised me the most about this car, in terms of how good it was, is actually the handling. This thing handles so well, especially for something that's comparatively using such old technology by today's standards. It feels great through corners. In fact, here's another hot take for you. I think it's infinitely better than the handling on the older Jag XKR which I reviewed. That car was a little soft and wallowy compared to the newer XKR which I owned. This car from the 90s honestly feels almost as good as my 2007 car did. That's very impressive, and to me it does justify the idea of this car's pricing and existence far more than just a simple comparison to an XK on paper. These cars are so much more than their on-paper numbers, and this is a prime example of that. Now I think the biggest hot take that I'm going to say now in this video before we get into the, the risks of buying and the kind of prices you should expect, is one which some people might disagree with, some people may agree with, but I would ask you at least to have an open mind about what I'm about to say, because I'm going to explain some of the reasons why. Of all of the cars I've ever driven, you would probably think that a DB7 would remind me the most of an XK, for obvious reasons. It doesn't. In fact, the car out of all the ones I've driven so far, which this reminds me the most of, is the last one you'd probably ever think of. The 1990s Toyota Supra. This car feels so much like a Supra, it shocked me. And bear with me for a second, I'm not talking about the V12 of course, but look at it on paper. Both have around a 3 litre inline 6, forced aspiration, supercharged in this case, turbo in the case of the Toyota. They both have that classic little bit of early 90s to mid 90s lag, and then really spools up that power and torque to shove you in the back. They're both smooth and comfortable and poised and completely under control at all times. They're both comfortable and far more refined than they really need to be within their bracket of motoring, and they both have performance which exceeds their on-paper numbers. They even have a kind of similar shape, both being GTs with a very swoopy, pretty look to them. Now ironically, the Supra's worth a lot more than the DB7 these days, which is kind of crazy to compare a Toyota to an Aston in that way, but if you haven't driven both, I would strongly recommend it, especially in their stock forms. And even if you can only get your hands on an auto Supra such as I did, well, it actually compares even more closely then. They feel so similar, it really did shock me. But to me, that's a testament to how good the DB7 actually is, because the DB7 isn't given anywhere near the respect which the Supra has, but I think it actually kind of deserves it. And it almost makes me want a certain other thing which almost happened in this car's development to happen. In the earlier stages, it was actually proposed that instead of using this platform that they did, essentially a strong evolution of the XJS, it was proposed to possibly have a variation of the Ford Escort RS Cosworth's all-wheel drive system. What a machine that would have been. And even with an inline 6, I don't think a Jag XK would have really competed with that through corners. I mean, it's already better in my opinion, but imagine an all-wheel drive Aston. I'm sure some people would have hated that, but I would love to have seen that. Part of what I would love to see is actually, what if Aston Martin sourced the engine from Toyota? Imagine a 2JZ Aston. It would have sounded very similar, the performance would have been more than adequate, and you could feasibly have seen modern Astons with 1,000 horsepower. Now of course that never happened, but what then in terms of that actual ownership? Because, engine issues, electrical issues, all of these could plague a vehicle like this. So what are those potential issues? What kind of costs should you be expecting? And what can you use this for? That's a key point here. Well, in terms of pricing here in the UK, you pretty much enter the market at about 19,000. Those are for higher mileage cars. More average is about 22 to 25,000 for a mid to good one, and then for a show car upwards of 30,000. So it really depends on how much you want to spend. The yearly costs are going to be high. And of course that will depend on how much you use it, and that is a crucial difference. This is a critical difference and a massive advantage for the Jaguar. Now I'm probably going to do a showdown video between a Jag XK and an Aston DB7 at some point, but I'm not exactly sure when that will be. However, a key selling point of the Jag, as my own one proved, is that you can 100% use it every day if you want to. It's one of the best things about the car. It's not to say that it won't ever break down, but the running costs are pretty damn good for a GT, and it's a capable machine. You don't buy an Aston to use it every day. Some people do, but most people don't. With the Aston, it's kind of the inverse of the Jag. So if you are going to use a car a lot, such as a daily driver, you do need to be prepared to have a lot more than just the purchase price of this car to keep it in great condition. And some things, even with money, are never going to be perfect. It is, after all, 90s British technology. So it uses Ford parts, there's some Mazda parts, some Citroën parts, and of course some parts that they made themselves. The most common issues that these cars have, though, doesn't tend to be with the engine. The supercharger's reliable, need to keep it well oiled. The most common issues you're gonna find is going to be stuff like oil coolers, a rattle in the timing chain, which is an indicator that the tensioners need changing. The radiator thermostat and hoses on the inline 6 in particular. Suspension bushes, again, as a former Jag owner, I can confirm that is a common thing on those as well. The electrical faults on these cars tend to be expensive. For example, according to Classic and Sports Car, you're looking at about £1,500 for a new electric window motor. Again, it's an Aston, so what do you expect? The air conditioning is a very, very common fault, and even with a lot of money put into it, they can still break easily, or just never work properly in the first place in some cases. The tyres can be gotten through very, very fast, partially due to, of course, the kind of car it is, but also partially because some of the earlier ones were set up a little bit wrong, where the suspension geometry was off. Again, with the V12s, less of an issue, with these later cars, less of an issue, but some owners have even said you're looking at changing tyres every 5 to 10,000 miles even, because it can eat through them so quickly. And probably the most unfortunate thing about these inline 6s is that, at least according to that same article in Classic and Sports Car, the dual mass clutch for the 6-cylinder cars you can't really find anymore. So to get one, you're looking at basically $3,000 plus whatever to fit. That's a very expensive proposition. But here's the thing, just like a Maserati, if you buy one of these, it needs to be because you absolutely want one. You don't buy a DB7 because it's the most logical choice or the cheapest choice or the most economical choice. You buy one because you want one. Just like me with Maserati, I'm fully aware of the issues that they can have, and I chose to get a second one because I love them so much. You just need to be prepared to put the money and time into this car. If ultimately it's not worth it to you, then don't buy one. It's as simple as that. You have to love the car, and of course drive it first, but it needs to be a vehicle that you really are invested in, not that you're just buying because it's a cool car. If you just want to buy something because it's cool or fast or has a 90s GT shape, then honestly, just get yourself a Jag XK or an XKR, because you'll have most of the same stuff for a cheaper price and lower running costs. The Aston is for those who specifically want an Aston. Now, not to ruin the good vibes of this review so far, because it is an overwhelmingly positive review for the most part, I do need to mention that there was one clear drawback for me. And unfortunately, this one drawback, which you can probably guess, is the main reason why I would never buy one myself. And it's got nothing to do with reliability and nothing to do with running costs. It is in fact the space. I mentioned in my review of the earlier X100 Jag that XK and that XKR was surprisingly cramped for me, especially compared to the later car which I had, and I was concerned that the Aston would be the same. Now, funnily enough, the Aston is actually a little bit more comfortable than the Jag in my opinion. There's a little bit more space. However, it's still far too cramped for me to ever own myself, because although I fit in it enough to drive it here, after driving this car, my back was hurting. And I did feel like I was essentially pretzeled in two to drive it. But it's weird because the proportions inside the car are kind of good and bad at the same time. Of course, the rear seats are non-existent. The trunk space, I would say, is good enough for what it is. But inside, the leg length room is great. The leg width room, though, is apparently built for people with twig legs and not for larger people like me. Also, in regards to headroom, you can recline the seat and have plenty of space, but it's a car which seems more inclined to people who are long in the leg rather than long in the torso. So if, like me, you're over 6 feet and have a long torso, you are going to be cramped, for sure. I would say if you're 6 feet or under, especially in the leg, then you'll be okay in this car. If you're a bigger guy like me, probably not. Maybe stick to the Jag, in a newer form at least, which you can still get for about a similar kind of price as one of these. To me, this was, as I mentioned, easily one of the standout cars from the year, a lovely car to work with, and easily my favourite Aston that I've driven so far. I'm of course very keen to drive the V12, but in some ways, even though the V12 is refined and improved and certainly faster, I could actually see myself, somewhat ironically, preferring this one, because it just feels so unlike what you'd expect from an Aston. And any British GT car that feels as refined as something from Japan, like a Supra, which, you know, don't be fooled by the memes online, the Supra is a remarkably well-built bit of kit. So if this can even feel remotely like that, To me, that's very impressive. Overall though, that's it for my thoughts on the 6-cylinder DB7s. Of course, if you're newer to the channel, check out the other Aston reviews which I mentioned, my Jag reviews, and of course I've done a ton of other rivals for these as well, from Porsche, etc. So you can click the playlist here on screen, or below the video in the description to see all of my other Beards and Cars episodes, and of course stick around on the channel for more. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.